Good evening. Welcome to People's University Around the World in Literature and Language. Tonight we are coming at you from Italy. We were in Australia last week, and we've flown many thousands of miles to be with our instructor for the evening, Mr. Lou Volpe, who most of you know was a teacher of English, our native language, for many years at Wheeling Central. He was my teacher many years ago. And for many of us, he was a very influential teacher, especially for those of us who write. So here he is, Lou Volpe.
Mille grazie, Sean. Buonasera a tutti. Mi chiamo Luigi Volpe e sono molto felice di parlare con voi questa sera di uno dei più famosi e importanti romanzi italiani, I Promessi Sposi di Alessandro Manzoni. Questa sera impareremo un po' di lingua italiana. Viaggeremo in Lombardia e la sua capitale, Milano, il luogo della novella. Impareremo qualcosa sulla cucina italiana, molto buono, e le persone, e dopo discuteremo quest'opera d'arte. Spero gradirete questo momento insieme. Good evening, everyone. My name is Louis Volpe, and I'm very happy this evening to converse with you about one of the most famous and important Italian novels, The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, by Alessandro Manzoni. Tonight, we are going to learn a little bit of the Italian language, travel to Lombardy and to the capital, Milan, where the novel is set, learn something about the cuisine and the people, and then discuss this work of art. I hope we enjoy this time together. Now, for some of you, especially the two guys I paint with, Stan and Rob, you have to look at my face for an hour. I apologize. And no, Pat Cassidy, this is not going to be about the Italian mafia. However, when I talk about Italy, I have to start with my grandparents. All four of them came over, not from northern Italy, where this novel is set, but from southern Italy, Sicily. My grandpa Luciano came over at 14 years of age in 1899. He arrived in Manhattan, was eventually welcomed, no fences or walls, sold cigars on the streets of Little Italy in Manhattan, moved to Cleveland, got a fruit stand, then a fruit store, where my three uncles and my father worked for their whole lives. I'm indebted to him for a lot of whom I am. My other Italian grandfather, Giuseppe Massara, who also came from Sicily, came over at 21 years of age after fighting in World War I as a sergeant in the Italian army. Joe came over with his wife, Natalia DiMaggio, and their one-year-old daughter, and worked two jobs, in the evening at a spaghetti factory and during the day as a bricklayer, plasterer. He even came to Weirton, West Virginia for several years, took the train back and forth to help build Weirton Steel in the 20s and 30s. So I owe my grandparents a great deal. Those are my roots. And speaking of roots, this is great that Sean and Aaron and Kim have planned this, because the more we discuss novels from other countries, the more we get a sense of our roots, our own roots, and of our connections with people from all over. When you read a novel, a good novel, a great novel, like I Promessi Sposi, you get deeper and deeper into the lives of the people and the culture, and the distances between us are not so great wherever we are. So, here's a picture of Alessandro, and we're going to go to the plan for the evening. Very quickly, here's our plan. I'm going to talk a little bit about place, language, and culture. And then, you got some homework this evening. I'm just not going to lecture. I want to know if you read the novel, or even if you're interested or heard about it, if you have some initial responses, flash them on the screen, whether you text or whatever you're doing, tweet or however Sean gets them. with some initial responses. If we have some, we'll start the conversation there. I don't just want to give you facts, okay? I'd rather have an engagement, a conversation. Anyway, then we'll go into the background of the novel. You know, there's 3 histories of the novel that I explained to help us understand the novel better. We're going to have some discussion questions on the histories. What about the War of Mantle and Succession, part of the 30 Years' War? What about Manzoni and his life? I won't be able to answer all the questions, but we'll talk about them. Then the meat of the program will investigate and analyze the characters. All the time, remember, as I'm talking or you're looking at the slides, if you have questions or comments, you read the book, you have some trenchant comments on what's happening, on the characters, anything that comes to your mind, please interrupt and we'll go with that, okay? I become less important in the conversation, become a listener to you. We'll have a discussion of your favorite characters and why. They just jump off the page for me. The more and more I read this book, the more and more the characters are just so finely drawn. And then finally, we'll deal with the themes of the novel, what I think are some of the key themes of the novel. Some of them you probably gathered already. Others maybe will make you want to read again this great novel. Final thoughts, questions and responses if you haven't, so you see you're involved here. And then buonanotte, good night. So, first of all, let's look at the geography and topography of Lombardy, Italy. You know, the Lombards were a Germanic tribe who came around 568 and kicked out the Byzantine Empire of their territory. There's the 20 regions of Italy, and where we're going is up here at Lombardy in the red, very famous, important place. Here is the topographical map. My friend Quentin Northcraft did the maps for me and some of the other graphics. Thank you, Q. You see Lombardy here. Okay, let me. Hey, there's Lombardy. And there's the high Alps. There's Switzerland. You got the high Alps of Lombardy, the lower Alps, okay, and down, and Milan. Is it focused here? Let's see. Well, Milan's right about here. And, yep, Milan's right here. Good. Okay. And Lecco, right at the bottom of Lake Como, is where Renzo and Lucia, the hero and heroine of the novel, are. And Monza, Lucia has to escape to Monza. And Bergamo up here, that's where Renzo escapes to be with his cousin as they're chasing him, if you remember. It's mountains, hills, a lot of wine and cheese produced there. Then the high plains and the low plains, the Alta plains, okay, all kinds of wheats, etc., rice, and the lower plains. No, lower plains of the rice. Okay, there's a lot of water, rivers down there. Here's another map. Now you can see the main towns. Milano, where the Great Plague takes root. Bergamo, where Renzo goes to escape. Monza, where Lucia is sent to escape the devilish, fiendish Don Rodrigo. And Lecco, that's their birthplace. Well, actually a village outside of Lecco. Okay? So that's where we are. How about the language? Italian is a very colorful language. Even somebody as semi-literate as I can learn to speak some of it. Let's learn a few words here. Ciao, hello. You probably know that one already. Buongiorno, good morning. Great way to start the day, buongiorno. My wife says it to me in her Italian, in our Irish, Southern West Virginian dialect. Buongiorno. Oh, she's not watching, I'm dead. Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon. It's rarely used in Italy. Buonasera, good evening. Mi piace fare la conoscenza. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Pleased to meet you. Mi chiamo. My name is. I call myself. My name is. Come si chiama? What is your name? Come sta? How are you? Di dove è lei? Where are you from? Wheeling, West Virginia. Grazie. Thank you. Grazie mille. Thanks a lot. 1,000 times. Mille. You can see million in it. Mi scusi or permesso. Excuse me. You're in an Italian crowd in Rome. You hear permesso all the time, especially on a bus as you get claustrophobic. Probably not now with the COVID. Buses are half empty. Prego. You're welcome. Or don't mention it. Now, my friend Stan Koneski will look at Prego and think of the sauce he has with his spaghetti. And as I tell my Polish friend, Prego is not good sauce. It's not Italian sauce. Prego, yeah, thank you. You're welcome. Don't mention it. Mi dispiace. I'm sorry. Non comprendo. I don't understand. Grazie per la tua assistenza. Thanks for your help. Arrivederci. Goodbye. One of my favorites, Ti voglio bene. This is a very intimate phrase, I've been told. It's kind of untranslatable. Literally, I want the best for you. But it's really, I love you very much. They use the very personal T there. So tell it to your best friend or spouse this evening. Tell them you learned it from me. Va a diavolo. Go to the devil. And my friend Quentin found this. This is Dante's 9 Layers of Hell. You probably don't want to use this, but I thought you might like something colorful. So we got the 9 layers going down to the very funnel of complete darkness. Interestingly, Dante, while I'm talking about it, the master of the Italian Tuscan language, which Manzoni will use for the final edition of his novel, and which unified all of Italy linguistically. Dante has a layer right before the 9 layers of hell as the neutral zone, okay? Where people who are iffy, wishy-washy go as a neutral zone. It's not hell, but it's a neutral zone. And one of the priests in the novel, Don Abbondio, is Mr. Neutral. We'll talk about him. He fits there. Vedremo in cielo. I'll see you in heaven. Beautiful, again, an intimate phrase. Finally, every adolescent, every child, every adult knows mangiare, to eat. And so I give you 3 ways because you've got to eat. I want to eat, voglio mangiare. What is there to eat? Che cosa mangiare? Can we eat now? Possiamo mangiare adesso? Just a little language. Now the cuisine, tremendous cuisine. And I'm going to give you 7 of cuisines of Lombardy, Milan. Polenta tarana. Polenta is cornmeal, and it's not only Italian, but it's the meal that's hearty. Peasants and kings ate it. And this special polenta tarana, is made with a mixture of buckwheat meal and cornmeal. And then it's flavored with butter and cheese right before you serve it. So it's very hearty. You see the butter oozing out and the cheese at different places. I think those are mushrooms on top. I've had polenta, but not polenta tarana, but I like the picture and I want to eat it, so that's why I put it there. Ossobuco alla Milanese. The Milanese call it los bus alla Milanese. And ossobuco is a veal shank cut right down through the bone, so the marrow flavors everything, and cooked in a kind of stew or sauce with carrots, potatoes, etc. It's one of the key meals of Milan. And the word ossobuco translates as hollow bone, okay? You cut right through the bone. Cazuela. Cazo comes from pan. And this is cooked in an iron pan. And it's pork and cabbage, basically, mixed together. Let sit for a while. And the pork is just tender and delicious, as well as the cabbage. I'm sure it's close to some other ethnic dishes in Poland and Slovakia, etc. Cazuela. Risotto al Milanese, you probably know this one. And it's familiar here. It's beautiful yellow, soft rice flavored with saffron. The legend is, in the construction of the Duomo in the 16th century, it was invented either by the master glazer, glass worker, stained glass worker, whose name in Italian is Valerio di Pendale. I don't know what his Flemish name was. Or his apprentice, nicknamed Zafferano, saffron, because they would use saffron, the spice, to color the stained glass windows, give it its yellow color, so saffron. Okay, cotoletta alla Milanese, another favorite. This resembles Wiener Schnitzel from Vienna, okay? It's also a veal. The Viennese, Germans cook it in olive oil, breadcrumbs, and flour. The Italians only use breadcrumbs and butter. They have it a little thicker. The best that I've tasted, they're about a ½ inch thick, so it's like a steak. And they keep the bone in. There's the bone over there, all right? And they have now what's called elephant ears, just a big, and this may be an elephant ear. It looks like an ear here. It's a very big cut, it takes the whole plate, okay? Panettone, you probably know this, one of our wonderful shops in Wheeling sell it, especially at the holidays. It comes from pan de tonne, bread of luxury. Supposedly an Italian man wanted to woo his sweetheart, and he baked this raisin and fruit cake, candied orange and lemon peels, and gave it to her as a way of wooing her. She said yes, and they had it again for their wedding, panettone. Stracciatella. Stracciatella is basically chocolate chip ice cream. But a guy in Bergamo, Enrico Panettone, I don't think he's related to the panettone bread, but Enrico was working at a restaurant, and he decided to cut chocolate, shreds of chocolate in the vanilla gelati. And there we have stracciatella. Stracciacare, I pronounce it wrong. Stracciare means to tear or shred into pieces. So that's how it's a delicious gelato. That's where it comes from. It's one of the most popular ice cream varieties in the world. How about the people? I asked my friends in Milan for some help on this. I've only been to Milan once, but Stefano and Emanuela Bartolini asked them, how about the people? What do you like up there? I guess they said, we're like everybody, but I said, what are some of your outstanding characteristics? Independent. Obviously, Lombardy has been run over many times. The French, the Romans, Byzantines, the Spanish Habsburgs, where our novel takes place, the Spanish Habsburgs are in control of Milan. They're very independent. They're industrious. Milan, it has 1/5 of the gross national product of Italy, both agriculturally and in industry. They're workers. They work. They even have a little idiomatic expression, which I'll tell you in a minute, which the Bartolinis gave me about working and not being lazy. They're culturally and socially intelligent. Again, from the peasant to the count, they have a sense of their culture and the depth of their culture. Opera, literature, art, okay? And socially, they carry themselves well, not only in dress and manners, but in the way they communicate. And they're direct, no nonsense about them. They have a good sense of sarcasm and irony, like the Irish, but they're not overly in your face. So that's some of the things about the people, obviously not all of them. Bartolini's, I asked them for 5 idiomatic expressions. Actually, they gave me 6. I told Sean one's unprintable, contains parts of the body which we won't talk about. And I want you to notice here, Manuela gave me the Milanese first, the dialect, okay? And then the Italian, and the literal meaning, and then the figurative meaning. Now I want you to hear, I'm not gonna pronounce them exactly right, but I want you to hear the sounds and show you the difference between the Milanese and Italian. Because Manzoni, in his original first drafts of the novel, was using a lot of the Milanese dialect, okay? And the classical idioms. By the time he wrote it, finished the final copy in 1840, 1842, it had changed. He had turned to the Tuscan dialect, which he had decided was the language of the people. He had had clarified the language, gotten rid of some of the expressions that were only known to the Milanese, and the novel read, again, from peasant to king by a wide variety of people. It helped unify the language, and as the language became more unified, so did the people. Language is a key to the culture. We could go on and talk a little bit about language in this country, the use, the abuse of language, and talk a little bit about the culture, but that's for another lecture. I'll let Sean plan that and get some experts in on me. Here's the first one. Se le minga supa, le pan bagna. Se non è zuppa, è pan bagnato. If it isn't soup, it's wet bread. The common dish of the poor to make soup by boiling water, milk, leftover bread. They couldn't otherwise be eaten except because it had become too hard. Thus, the expression is used to describe 2 things that are basically identical. It isn't soup, it's bread. Va chiappa e rat. Well, you can see the one word there, and that's exactly what it means, rat. Vai a prendere I topi. See the difference in the dialect? And we have dialects here too. Sometimes they're hard to understand. Go chase the rats. If you are telling someone to chase a hated and disease-carrying pest, it means you're not very fond of him or her. Thus, a polite way of telling someone to get lost. Batti pan, compare la stria. Battere I pani, compare la strega. Dusting off clothes makes the witch appear. La strega is the witch. And if you read I Promessi Sposi, one of the scapegoats for the plague, and there were many scapegoats, were the fact that witches created the plague, created the typhus that spread throughout the city. In the old days, talking 16th century, the judges of Milan were also responsible for punishing witches. In order to identify the culprit, the witch, that had placed a spell on someone, the magistrates would beat the clothes worn by the victim of the spell. Then the first person to show up at the trial was accused of witchcraft. Very logical, eh? It is now used to describe the occasions when you are talking about someone and that person actually and unexpectedly appears, as if by magic. Battere I pani, compare la strega. Voglia dall'uara saltami addosso. Voglia di lavorare saltami addosso. Desire to work, jump on me. That's the way the Bartolini's gave it to me, so I didn't question it. Phrase usually said to a really lazy person. The direct way of inviting someone to be more energetic and lively. And lastly, fare disfa e tutto lavora. Fare e disfare e tutto lavorare. Building up and tearing down is a lot of work. Used to describe those tasks that never seem to end because they're constantly changed, postponed, or put on hold. So those are some of the idiomatic expressions coming to Italian, and you can see the difference, at least to some extent, in the language. Okay, our first discussion. Now we're on the novel. What were your initial thoughts, reactions, emotions, impressions upon first reading the novel? Or what are the first words that come to you when describing the novel? Anybody have anything? Anything come up, Sean? I see people are watching. Somebody said Irish food is better. I don't know about that. That's all right, Kim, no problem. We'll just go on, and if you have a question, give it to us. All right, we've got to talk about the three histories of the novel. Great novels, Tolstoy's War and Peace, Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, et cetera, aren't written in a vacuum. The author obviously, usually indirectly, brings his own history into the novel. Many times there's a historical situation, not where the novel is set. And oftentimes the historical situation at the time the author is writing also impacts or impinges on the novel. I think we have three histories in this novel. First of all, 1628 to 30 Years' War, and 200 years later, 1828, Manzoni's times in Italy, and then Manzoni and his life itself, though more indirect in the novel. So let's talk about the 30 Years' War very quickly. It's very complicated war, very crazy. But anyway, it started as a battle among the Catholic and Protestant states that formed the Holy Roman Empire. But gradually, like always, it became less about religion and more about which group would ultimately govern Europe. And no fancy words, land grabbing. Who can own the most land among kings and counts and dukes? But there were more than 8 million casualties in this 30-year war. And it changed the geopolitical face of Europe and the role of religion and nation states in society. Nations started to be defined, okay? Less about religion and more about the state and the people. And that, in some extent, was a good thing. The Peace of Westphalia laid the groundwork for the formation of a modern nation state. It altered the balance of power in Europe. The Habsburg empires, both Spanish and Austrian, went down. The French Empire went up, as well as others. And then, along with this, and probably what the novel talks about the most, is hundreds of thousands died as a result of famine, disease, and violence. What war brings us, like nothing else. And the first European witch hunts, hunt for Australia. Suspicion, scapegoat, and they attributed it to spiritual causes. Well, the witches are the cause, and other scapegoats. Most of all, I found this interesting. What developed during this war is the fear of the other. Boundaries and borders, which were much looser before this, became more separated. Fences, walls, if you want, were built to separate, not just Lutheran from Catholic, Catholic from Calvinist, but territorially. And the fear of the other spread. I found that very interesting in my reading. Sorry. Now, this 30 Years' War extends to Lombardy. It's called the War of the Mantuan Succession. At the time of the novel, as the novel begins, the Spanish Habsburgs are in control of Lombardy. Don Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordova. He's the governor. But they're fighting the French of Valois, the Duke of Nevers, for 2 territories. He's a Gonzaga from Mantua, okay? Montferrat, and it's under siege when the novel begins, and Mantua, okay? And consequently, this war brings other evils to this section of Lombardy and to the people of the novel. Then there's Manzoni and his times. A little bit about Manzoni. There's his dates, March 7, 1785, to May 22nd, 1873. Found it interesting that they considered him a slow developer in school, considered a dunce by some. Maybe his imagination was way above everybody else's. He proved it later. At 22, he was a rationalist and a skeptic. Prove it to me, otherwise I doubt it. His mother and father separated. She went to France and joined a group of artists and ideologues, and Manzoni later followed. And so for a number of years, he was in France, and he wrote poems in the classical tradition. He was, for a while, a fan of Voltaire, critical of revealed Christianity. He criticized revelation, whether it really happened or not. He was a deist, believing that God created the world, was at a distance. And he was strongly opposed to intolerance and bigotry. Okay? A good thing. One of the inheritances of the French Revolution and Voltaire. But in 1808, he married Henriette Blondel from Geneva, a wonderfully kind woman, originally a Calvinist. Not to make too much of this, she became a Roman Catholic, a devout woman, and she influenced Manzoni in a tremendous way, moving him from his skeptical stance to a believer. And I'm not using this as a polemic for Roman Catholicism. This is the way it happened. In 1810, she became a Catholic, and this influenced Manzoni. And he had an intense religious crisis, a dark night of the soul, if you want. He also had, during those years, from 1808 to 1810. And in 1810, he too became a Catholic. They had 6 children, and he retired back to his estate near Lecco and gave himself to farming and husbandry. He had many workers and literature, on the family estate. And there he stayed with side trips to Florence and Rome the rest of his life, writing and farming. Now, his wife died in 1833, and Manzoni was despondent for a number of years. But in 1837, he married Teresa Bori, who was a widow of a count, and they had 3 more children. So 9 children in all. 6 of Manzoni's children and both his wives died before he did. One interesting fact, in 1818, he had to sell his paternal inheritance, his farm, his father's farm, as his money had been lost to his dishonest agent. The interesting thing about this, and shows a lot about Manzoni, he was a tremendously generous man, an egalitarian. His farmers on his land owed him money, debts. Rather than calling their debts forward after he had lost his land, he canceled all their debts and gave them the whole maize crop for themselves, to support themselves for a time. This was Manzoni through and through. This is only one example. I could give you many others. What he became as a Christian, he showed in action. And the novel has a lot of this. People who don't talk a whole lot, like Lucia Mondella, but whose actions radiate this kind of belief. 1873, his eldest son, Pier Luigi, died. And not soon after, less than a month, Manzoni died. He had fallen about 6 weeks before that, before his son, Pier Luigi, died on the steps of a church. And he had cerebral meningitis, and then he died. His funeral was celebrated in the Church of San Marco like a royal funeral, And his remains lay there for some days, is all literally mourned. By that time, Italy was unified, and he was one of the causes of the unification, bringing the Italian language to everyone, creating a novel that everybody could read. Okay? Giuseppe Verdi's great Requiem was written to honor his memory. So, a little bit about Manzoni. Now, how about the historical value of the novel? Bringing these three histories together, what do we have? All Italy took part in the disputes about language, literature, and politics during the 19th century. Even my one grandfather would tell me that in Italy at the end of the century, people in the towns and the villages would get together after dinner, walk through the village squares, the town squares, and talk, men arm in arm, women arm in arm. That was their culture. They would talk, usually without fighting, about language, literature, and politics. My grandfather Giuseppe read Manzoni when he was 16. I don't know about my grandfather Luciano. They would gather in town, cities, and villages. So it was a religious, artistic, social, and political culture from peasant to aristocrat. And as they read, and as they listened to opera, and as they talked, they were bound together as a culture. Both the author and the novel became symbols, inspirations for the Italian resurgence, political and social movement for the Italian states. It was a unifying patriotic message, Italy for Italians. No Habsburgs, no French, just us. And it was a fundamental milestone in the development of a modern, unified Italian language, the stabilization of the language and linguistic unity throughout Italy. So the novel has a lot to say the way it was written. And of course, I read it in English, as most of you did, but you read it in Italian. The language speaks out as a language which is common to all people. Risorgimento began in the rebellions of the 20s and 30s, but came to a climax in the 1848 rebellion. And there were rebellions all over Europe at that time. Manzoni's novel, especially the final edition in 1842, paved the way for Italy's unification and a final step to nationhood in 1861. So besides the Civil War in this country in 1861, something very magnificent was happening in Italy. So the novel was widely read as a thinly veiled allegory critiquing Austrian rule. Austrian rule, which really didn't dissipate finally from several areas of Italy until World War I. And the 1840 version was a standardized version of the Tuscan dialect. Conscious effort by the author to provide a language, colloquial language, free of pretensions, free of dialects, moving prose that most Italians from north to south could understand. Or you talk about a novel creating tremendous effect, like Solzhenitsyn's novels that helped bring down the communist regime. Okay, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Cancer Ward, the Gulag Archipelago. So literature and language paving the way for change, for great change, for important change. Okay. Second discussion. Having read the novel, or not having read it, what events or people surface in your mind that have parallels or significance to the two historical time periods of 1628 and 1828? Any parallels to our times and to the two time periods that I mentioned? Stan and Rob, I know you're listening attentively. Okay, thank you. Do you think the story was plot-based or character-driven? Wonderful, Kathy Northcraft. Thank you for that. It's a good question. I think it's character driven. I think Manzoni, as it is, the plot is good. It's interesting. It's fascinating. But it's when the characters that are involved in the plot shine. For example, the theme of forgiveness. Some of the major scenes are where one character is forgiving another. The dialogue and the insight into the characters, in some senses, and I'll talk about this, a quick change with the person known, named, the unnamed, is conversion, is change, and is asking forgiveness from the Cardinal Archbishop. In other cases, the change is much slower. It takes Renzo a long time to forgive Don Rodrigo, who has lusted after his beloved Lucia. And he only at the end does he realize the supreme importance of forgiveness in one's life. So I would say the characters more than the plot. That's a matter of opinion. But thank you. Thanks, Kim. Salem witch trials and us, 1628. Yeah. We've got a good many scapegoats. A good many scapegoats in our time. People looking for scapegoats. I won't name them. You know them. Some are other countries. Some are other people. Some are scientists. Enough said. What about Nat Turner's revolt for 1828? Back to your other question. Yeah, it's funny. I think American independence and freedom was only half finished. And the last 150 years, we're still working through to a freedom and a unification of our country. That has to happen. And the young people especially are calling for it to happen. But all of us realize that deep down inside, it took about 100 years for Italian unification to really occur fully. I simplified it. It started around the 1820s, but really it wasn't until the World War I that Italy came to be unified both in law and culture. So the same thing is happening here. And we've got a lot of anger. We've got a lot of talk. We've got some violence. So yeah, I think that's there. I'm glad you saw that because it's the novel is still great. Literature is still talking to us in many ways, both personally and so socially and nationally. Any other questions? I'm getting excited with these questions. All right. This has to be Kathy Northcraft's wonderful husband, Quentin, who did the designs. The government tries to solve a problem not by addressing it, but by making an obtuse law that just makes it worse. Is that not exactly how things are done today? And Manzoni's insights on mob mentality during both the riots and the plague in general are more relevant than ever. I'll stop right there for a minute, Quentin. Beginning of the novel, the government, over a period of 40 years, keeps making laws, and it doesn't do a thing. And this remembers the Spanish Habsburgs. We'll make a law against outlaws, okay, against bravos, gangs, and it'll be solved. Nothing happens. Nothing happens, okay? So the governments are ineffectual. What was the other part of that question? Good. And mob mentality. Sadly, wherever you have lawlessness and not just the wealthy, but the wealthy are in power but distant from the people, you have gangs who will try to siphon what they can, get what they can. Okay, and the second part of your question? Notice how the outsiders of society were immediately blamed for spreading the plague and victimized or even killed. Yeah, somebody walks into town, is different in Milan. They want him killed. Today, it's still the outsider who's suspect, who hasn't been given full recognition, who's distanced. We could go down to the places in the Southwest where the outsider is suspect, whether they're all bringing drugs or they're bringing people who don't want to work, or whether perhaps they have criminal intent. So yes, very good. And fear does that. There's a wonderful, I think it's chapter 20 in Promessi, Sposi, where Manzoni talks about fear and how fear creates frenzy, and frenzy creates scapegoats. It's so common to us all. The more afraid we get, the more we point fingers, and the more chance for violence. Do you think the unification of the Italian language that the betrothed helped bring about also propagates the fear of the other? That's a good question. I never thought about it. Does that lead to the type of nationalism that saw Mussolini come to power? You know, the fascists gained, ironically, they had their first and largest movement in Milan, the city we're talking about, where the plague came. Was that a sense of their own superiority over time? Was that a sense that you can become too nationalized and close your border? I think so. That's very possible. Nationalism at the time for Italy, after being overrun for 1,600 years, was probably a good thing. It brought all these different dialects and regions together. The Sicilians in the south, you know, who were considered rough, Cretini, Calabrese down there, those folks, my parenti, my relatives. And so unifying gave a greater freedom and belonging. Part of the problem was, this is very true, you made me think about it as I read, the wealth from the north was not spread quickly enough through law and economic parity to the south, to the central region south of Rome, Naples, etc. And that caused a backwardness in the south that continued through the first half of the 20th century. There was no sharing of wealth. They could say we're unified, but along with unity comes the sharing of wealth, economic products, acceptance. So there was still that fear of the other. That's a very trenchant question. It's a very good observation. And of course, very topical. Pardon me? Hi. Super Myers. I think I know you. Yes. I'm interested in what you said about this novel being important to Italy's unification. As you know, my family is from Sicily, all right, and southern Italy as well. Did the events that happened in the novel also happen in the southern part of Italy? And when it was published, did southern Italy also see the novel as theirs, since southern and northern Italy could sometimes be divided in thinking? Yes, but much slower. I don't like to admit it, but the Catholic Church and pious people of southern Italy had a greater hold and more resistance in some circles to unification than northern Italy. Was it an economic factor, perhaps? Was it a religious factor? The fact that Pope Pius IX at first favored Italian unification. He was leaning towards it. Then he got scared for a lot of reasons. One was losing the papal states. One was the danger of liberalism, which would obviate religion, which would negate religion, which wasn't true. Wasn't very trusting either. So I think the South was slower. And my grandfather used to tell me, he went north to fight in the war, and he educated himself. When he came back, he found that Sicily and those areas were a little more backward, and he was restless for both education and travel. and culture. I don't want to make that as a wholesale statement. And some people in the South will disagree. Let me end with by saying, Sue, that I'm not that well educated on that question. I'm hypothesizing. So don't take my words for gospel. Okay? Terrific questions. I paid Quentin and Kathy, by the way, to send in those questions, but not Sue and Aaron. I think we'll skip it and go on, because it's pretty much the same. How about the novel itself? Okay, you know it's a sympathetic portrayal of two lovers, peasants from the town near Lecco, whose plans to marry are thwarted by a vicious local tyrant and the cowardice of their parish priest. But then there are courageous people, from self-giving friar to a determined mother to a reformed lord, help the lovers to be reunited. So there's wonderful human and moral dimensions of the novel. First of all, Manzoni, we call it a romance. It ends happily. It ends with a wedding. But he's very realistic about the evils of life. Remember, 6 of his children and both his wives died before he died. His eldest son, right before he died. He is not immune to the existence of evil and presents it boldly and forthrightly. His tolerance for the petty vices in human beings. There's a lot of comedy, especially in the second reading, when you get over the war and the famine and the disease and the deaths. When not get over it, but when you see that, it strikes you. But when you look back at the characters and some of the scenes, and I'm sure it's better in the Italian, he's got a tolerance for petty vices in human beings. All of us have pettiness, and all of us have those vices which keep us from being our best selves. Manzoni was a convert. He converted to Roman Catholicism. He believes religion as a source of both comfort and peace for humanity and the inspiration for real human dignity. And he presents 3 characters. The Cardinal, Archbishop of Milan, Federico Borromeo. Her name just escaped me. Lucia Mondesi and Fra Cristoforo as ideals of Christian faith and belief. And they don't tout their morality on anybody. It's interesting. Manzoni was not conservative in that way. Morality came before spirituality. It was the actions of these people, more so than their words, which led people to them, which endeared people to them. And I find that, I wish that were more true today. There's delicate yet unswerving humor in the midst of evil. Humor, we get the word humility, humus, soil. There's humor. And that's the balance that Manzoni creates that I think people appreciate. There's tragedy, there's comedy. And it's an artistic work from top to toe. It's a commitment to art balanced with a commitment to morality, good and evil. Not just showing good and evil, but creating a novel that's artistically done and beautifully done. Okay, characters. Now, here's where I want you to interrupt me. If I say something about a character and you got a response, go to it, okay? Our first character, he's the first character in the book, is Don Abbondio. He's the curate and the priest of the village. I told you he probably belongs in Dante's neutral zone before hell, okay? Because he's a whiner. The glass is always half empty. And he tries to play it safe all the way through the novel. Even when good things happen, he's looking behind him for something bad to happen. Here's a great quote. Neither noble, rich, nor valiant, he had from early youth found himself alone and unaided in such a state of society, like an earthen vessel thrown amidst iron jars. He's just a weak vessel, they'll say. He therefore readily obeyed his parents, who wished him to become a priest. He did, to say the truth, not regard the obligations and the noble ends of the ministry to which he dedicated himself, but was only desirous to secure the means of a living and to connect himself with a powerful and respected class. So prestige and safety. Okay? 3 hots and a cot. That's Don Abbondio from beginning to end. At one point in the novel, after he's in that wonderful scene where the unknown, the rich lord, powerful, has controlled people and used violence to gain power. He converts, and he's with the Cardinal Archbishop, and Don Abbondio is there. And the unknown sheds tears and is hugged by the Cardinal. And the Cardinal says, "Thank you, I needed you. I knew who you were, and I needed you for my own soul." Don Abbondio is in the background, shaking his head and saying, "Thieves and saints, they cause all the trouble. They ask us to be something better than we are. All I want is to be left alone. It's these thieves that convert and these saints that make us choose to act, have to act." So he's a fascinating comic character, and he's balanced by his housekeeper, Perpetua. She's constant. That's her name. She's constant. She does all kinds of things for this lazy Puritan. Here's a quote. "An affectionate and faithful domestic who knew how to obey or command as occasion served, to bear the grumbling and whims of her master at times, and at others to make him bear with hers. These were becoming every day more frequent. She had passed the age of 40 in a single state. The consequences, she said, of having refused all the offers that had been made to her. Her female friends asserted that she had never found anyone willing to take her." A little irony about her. So she's a spinster, but she's in charge of the household. And in her bantering with Don Abbondio, she has the upper hand. Lorenzo, one of the lovers. I'm not going to read this, you can see it. He's a silk weaver and he has a little farm. And there's a famine at the time, so he's trying to survive. But he's in love with Luchese. He's a good human being and dedicated and faithful to her. And in their distance from each other, he strives to be reunited through all the trials and tribulations. His one fault is he wants revenge. When he sees evil happening, whether it's the plague in Milan or Don Rodrigo, he wants revenge. And it's only at the end of the novel when Fra Cristoforo takes him to see Don Rodrigo, who's dying of the plague, that Renzo can look upon him and forgive him. And that's his freedom. Then he's ready to marry Lucia. Lucia Mondella, her name means light of the world. Just this first quote. But beyond all these ornaments of her wedding outfit was the modest and beautiful joy depicted on her countenance. She doesn't have too many lines in the novel, okay? She's not a person of words. I want to point out her modesty, her joy comes from inside. She's got an interior life that's been cultivated. And if you know people, I've got some friends who have a great interior life, they don't have to say much to know that their life is deeply wedded to the divine, if you will, to God. She radiates that, and everybody else knows it. They don't talk about it, they just know it. That's Lucia. The bad guys and the good guys, the good people, they know it, okay? When Renzo talks about revenge, they're going to be separated and have to go their way. She says, "I know, Renzo, for the love of heaven," cried Lucia. No, for the love of heaven. There is a God who watches over the oppressed. But do you think he will protect us if we do evil? In her simple insight, she knows that if we believe, we're watched over, whether good or evil happens to us, but we can't give in to the evil. It's difficult to be that holy, that good. There's Agnese, Lucia's mother, and she's a down-to-earth, clever person. She acts, and she has several plots she concocts to get the two married. And She's got a sarcastic temperament. She calls it like it is. And that's all I want to say about her, but she comes in and out of the novel. Fra Cristoforo. He's a friar, a Capuchin friar. And he, again, is a person whose actions speak louder than his words. He doesn't say a lot. He writes letters. He makes plans for the lovers and for others. His actions speak louder than words. At the end of the novel, the narrator tells us, we don't see the scene. He dies in the lazaretto, where they have taken the thousands of people who have the plague. And he's been there for any number of months with other friars and other people helping the dying. He too dies. And we just have a very couple of sentences where the narrator, the outside omniscient narrator, tells us that Father has died. And Lucia says, we will pray for him. That's enough. Wonderful character. He was an aristocrat, son of a wealthy merchant. Ludovico is his real name. But he leaves the rich lifestyle. And his conversion is gradual. He initially wants to get back at all the rich people who ignore the poor. So he has kind of a gang and goes around the streets looking for fights to do good. But when one of his friends, when a nobleman kills his friend, they're having an argument, all of them, and his friend, Cristoforo, his steward, is killed, then the complete change in Cristoforo is done. He joins the Capuchins, hides in a monastery, and changes his name from Ludovico, which basically means I love to play, to Cristoforo, make myself Christ, to be made into Christ. Another quote, he's got a temper. He lashes out still at some of the rich, Don Rodrigo and some others, but he tempers it. He has great self-control and does good. Don Rodrigo is, if you want, the villain of the novel. He's a young nobleman. He's got money and he's got power and doesn't do anything for everybody. He lives in his castle on the summit of the hill, away from the suffering. He feels invincible, often as the young do. He's obsessed with Lucia. He's proud. And he wants to win the bet with his cousin, the Count, that he can capture her within a certain amount of time. He loses the bet and he feels humiliated, okay? And he's got a gang of bravos, any number of bravos who hang around at this time of plague and famine. They do his bidding. He has nothing but contempt for Fra Cristoforo and for morality. He dies at the end, as I said, in the lazaretto, weak and enfeebled. I'm not going to spend much time with this woman, La Signora Gertrude. Her story is fascinating. It's rather complex. She's an agonized young woman who wants to be married, but can't tell her father because her father has planned, as many nobles did for their children, to enter the seminary of the convent. Only the oldest son, especially, was reserved to take over the heritage, the noble heritage. And her father, he says very little, but he's one character that I detested immensely because he ruins his daughter, and because she has not developed a freedom, she's not able to challenge him, and she's wishy-washy. She never tells the truth, and her life ends sadly. Consequently, I said she never discovers herself and becomes twisted, wringing herself sick with anger and guilt. And she gets into a bad relationship. She's in a convent, but she has a relationship with a bravo. How for that? The unknown. He has the biggest conversion in the book. He's an aristocrat, probably a Visconti, from the Visconti family, who during the Middle Ages were dukes of Milan. He lives in a castle on a jagged hill. He's unapproachable. And nobody even mentions his name. He's known as the unknown. He's removed from society. His village at the bottom of the hill is terribly poor. His yeomen are outlaws, and he wields power to force and convert coercion. But he's constructed a prison within himself, just like La Senora and Don Rodrigo, different types of prisons. We could talk about that, but we won't. Finally, the Archbishop of Milan, who really existed, Federico Borromeo, cousin of St. Charles Borromeo, but holy in his own right. There's no us and them mentality with him. He's far ahead on the Christian scale. Everybody's the same. He goes among people of all types, visits all his people, available to everybody. He travels beyond his castle in Milan to all the villages, greets and blesses others, gives away his money. I'm not going to quote this, but the famine comes and he tells the chancery, you could see parallels maybe, he tells the people in the chancery, take money from other sources and set up a fund for all the poor. And he gets 12 curates, priests, to go through the town and give money to the poor, and also give money to them to help them get along after they have eaten. So the money, he's very good with that, and he gives his own money. One great story, no? Do I have it here? Oh yeah, on one occasion he saved a young lady from being immured in a convent, kind of parallel to La Senora. Against her wish, her selfish father pretended he could not marry her suitably without a portion of 4,000 crowns. The bishop advanced the money. True story. Anything for people. People come first. He's a wonderful character. Okay, sorry. Okay. Last discussion, and then we'll say goodbye. How do the four horsemen of the apocalypse figure into this story? Simple question. Four horsemen of the apocalypse, anybody know? War, famine, disease, and death. War brings all the others. And we see this gradually in the story. So actually, the pestilence was caused by soldiers coming from Germany and Austria into fight in the War of Mantuan Succession. And gradually the plague took hold. It reached its peak in Milan, where over a third of the population died. And there's this gruesome scene, really gruesome, of the Moniti, guys who picked up the dead in the town and carried them on their carts to the lazaretto. Besides writing this novel, eventually listening, what else the novel said? We already talked about this. Any characters or scenes in the novel, maybe some that I talked to you about, especially interest you? And finally, a question we've asked already that you've noticed very well, any relevance to today's political, economical, social, and religious situations? Okay, Stan and Rob, I hope you haven't fallen asleep, but I'm with you. I'll see you tomorrow at painting. What's for lunch? Last thoughts, some of the themes of the novel, and not the one that stands out for a lot of people is the political situation, which is very strong and causes so much havoc among the ordinary people. But I want to talk about forgiveness very quickly. There's three scenes, major scenes of forgiveness. First of all, Fra Cristoforo to the brother of the man he had murdered. Fra Cristoforo goes out and seeks the brother of the man he had murdered. He threw himself on his knees before him, whom he had most injured, crossed his hand on his breast, and bending his head exclaimed, I am the murderer of your brother. God knows that to restore him to life, I would sacrifice my own. But as this cannot be, I supplicate you to accept my useless and late apology for the love of God. Wonderful scene. And of course, Fra Cristoforo gives his life at the end for many. The unknown to Archbishop Federico Borromeo, that's a powerful scene. This man supposedly hardened in his life, 60 years old. When he sees Lucia, because he keeps her in his place for Don Rodrigo, captures her, but he sees her, and all his past life comes back to him in her light. And he has a tremendous, all night he's up in agony, looking over who he is. And the right grace comes along the next day. He goes to see the cardinal who's traveling to his village below at the bottom of the mountain and gives himself over to forgiveness. And then, as I told you, Renzo before the dying Rodrigo. I mentioned God's providence, and maybe some of you don't believe in this. It's challenging. In times of political and social chaos, where is God? Is there really a God who cares for us? In times of personal and communal suffering, is there really a God? And how does God's providence take effect? How is his watchful care over us? And lastly, and I think Manzoni is suggesting that suffering, even though we detest suffering, all of us, and it's a great problem, and imminent chaos, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and actually deepen rather than dampen faith. It's something I would suggest that one has to experience, and I am probably in no position to talk about it in any great way. It's a great mystery. Finally, marriage. Renzo and Lucia are married at the end. They have a little wedding in their village, very simple. For Manzoni, it was a sacramental union, the reality of marriage. It's a sacramental union between two people. It presupposes fidelity and faith in each other. But there's also the symbol of marriage in the novel, a marriage of people, a union of people, races, and nationalities. Underneath, Manzoni was talking to the Italian people about the marriage of Italy and of all these different nationalities and dialects and mixed people, the dark-skinned folks from the south, the lighter people from the north, and everybody in between. And finally, marriage is a direction and a goal, not simply a state. And this is more spiritual, and I leave you with this. It's the marriage of the human with the divine. From my perspective, as a religious man with many faults, I believe that the human and divine are merging together. There's a marriage going on, okay? And it's happening, and I believe it will happen in time. Last quote at the wedding. The happy day at length arrived. The betrothed went to church where they were united by Don Abbondio. The day after, the wedding party made their visit at the castle to the unknown. They go see him, this man who has helped give Lucia her freedom. We will leave the reader to imagine their reflections on entering those walls. In the midst of their joy, however, they felt that the presence of the good Father Cristoforo was wanting to complete it. But, said Lucy, he is happier than we are, assuredly. She has the last word. And I leave you with the last word. Buonanotte, good night. And thank you, everyone, for listening to me and for your questions. I thank my grandparents, especially Giuseppe and Luciano. Without you two and the grandmother, I wouldn't be here. Okay, and that's a big thing. And without you creating my mother Rose and my father Paul, I wouldn't be here. They got together on that November night, and 9 months later, Luigi Volpe was born. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Mr. Volpe. Excellent program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We did have a question about the best English translation of the novel. Do you have a recommendation, or?
I've only read two. The Penguin, I guess, has been touted, and I forget who the translator is. I think he's British.
Okay.
It's a Penguin edition, and I got that. And then I also got this one. This is one I most recently read. I think it's a good translation, but it is what's it say? Originally published in London in 1834. This is an unattributed translation, Manzoni's 1827 work. It's in the public domain. So
There you go.
but I found it good. Probably the Penguin is the best. He updated, he kept everything. I can't remember the fellow's name, I'm sorry. But if you look under the Betrothed on the internet, you'll get all the translations.
Okay, thank you. And next week, I just mentioned our programs on Tuesday at noon. Becca Corellis and Sarah Venter will take us inside their shop. They're preservationists, show us some of the work they do. And then our final class in this series will be on Thursday evening when Dr. Kim Gruey and her assistant, who will teach us Spanish, will be on for the final class. But then on August 6th, we will do the Geography B with Dr. Javersack returning, and you will have the opportunity to win gift certificates to local restaurants by participating in that. Yes, Professor White. I'm sorry, she just joined the cast, and I drew a blank. So join us Tuesday and Thursday, and thank you again to Lou Volpe. Good night, everyone.